I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting tonight. In the spirit of reconciliation, the Australian National University recognizes that it is situated on country for which the Ngambri Ngunnawal people have been custodians for many centuries, and on which they have performed age-old ceremonies of celebration, initiation, and renewal. We acknowledge their living culture and unique role in the life of this region, and offer our deep appreciation for their contribution to and support of our academic enterprise. Now, you've probably heard this before at functions at ANU, at various ANU functions, but I think it's important in the context of something I think is significant is climate change. And also, it's significant in that the two countries which are involved in the dialogue tonight, Canada and Australia, have somewhat similar situation in terms of trying to improve the relationship and the integration between Indigenous owners and people who've come later to these continents and countries. I'd like to start by saying that the Climate Change Institute here in ANU is very honoured and privileged to have been asked by the High Commissioner of Canada to be its partner in this Federation dialogue. And I'd like now to call on His Excellency, the High Commissioner of Canada, Mr. Michael Lair, to say a few words on behalf of Canada. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Professor Stephan, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And certainly on behalf of the Canadian High Commission, it's my pleasure to welcome you all to tonight's dialogue. I'd really like to thank our two leaders here tonight, Professors Barry Smit and Stephen Dovers, for bringing their expertise to this event. I'd also like to thank Dr. Norman Abjorensen for moderating the dialogue and ANU for providing this wonderful facility. As well, I'd like to extend our appreciation to our co-sponsors, the Climate Change Institute and ACSANS, the Association of Canadian Studies in Australia and New Zealand, without whose partnership we would not be able to bring this event off this evening. And of course, I'd like to welcome and thank all of you for taking your time to come and listen on what is a very important issue. Since its inception in 2001, this series has examined many engaging topics, from the rule of law to citizens' rights to Indigenous art. Tonight's dialogue on the federal management of resources and climate change comes at a time when international collaboration on the environmental challenges is particularly important. Canada and Australia are very strong global partners on a wide range of issues, and it's no surprise that we together have been working closely on this very important issue. But there's also another unique dimension that comes out of the topic tonight. It's the fact that we are the only two federal states with Westminster models, and it provides particular opportunities and challenges. So it's not only are we talking about a global issue, that of climate change, but also something that's particular and unique to us, the fact that Canada and Australia enjoy those two unique government systems as federal states. And we look forward to working together on this issue. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you again for joining us tonight, and it's certainly been my pleasure to be part of this dialogue, and I hope you enjoy this event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Now I'd like to formally introduce the partners in this dialogue event tonight. First of all, Professor Barry Smit. He leads the Global Environmental Change Program at the University of Guelph in Canada. And in 2007, he was a co-recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize for his contributions to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. Throughout his extensive research career, Professor Smit has published widely and completed one of the world's first climate change impact analyses. And this was, in fact, very much recognized around the world as a scene setter for something that has grown very rapidly in importance as we realize that we have to adapt to climate change in addition to mitigating it. His consultations, workshops, and research have been conducted in more than 30 countries around the world. Professor Stephen Dovers is the director of the Fenner School of Environment and Society here at the ANU, which is housed in the ANU College of Medicine, Biology, and Environment. His research in environmental policy covers the theoretical dimensions of sustainability, resource management, science policy linkages, climate change adaptation, and Australian environmental history. So that you can see that he has a very broad understanding of the fundamentals of climate change and sustainability issues. Professor Dovers has published widely, as well as supervising some 45 doctoral students and consulting for many public and private sector organisations. Our moderator tonight is Dr. Norman Abjorensen. He's a prominent media commentator on Australian politics, and he teaches here in political science at the Crawford School of Economics and Government in the ANU College of Asia and the Pacific. I'd now like to turn it over to Norman to moderate tonight's dialogue. Thank you very much.
We've got you in here with a good headline, and just speaking to our two key speakers tonight, there are bears and not a lot of bushfires, but quite a lot of water and other things, particularly climate change. We're going to keep it fairly informal, so our keynote speakers have agreed to drop the titles, so it's Barry and Steve rather than Professor Smit and Professor Dovers. Australia's won the toss and has sent Canada into bat, so Barry will open the batting. If I could just pick up a couple of points from Michael's introduction there. The similarity between Canada and Australia in being a Westminster system and a federal structure is fairly unique. So we've got a lot in common within the way we do things, the processes through which we work. There's a glass half empty and a glass half full view of federalism. The glass half empty view when dealing with something as challenging as climate change is that federalism just adds another dimension of complexity. That's one way of looking at it. The glass half full, the more optimistic side, is it multiplies the minds that can be brought to bear on some of these issues. And I think I'm inclined to the latter view. I think we're seeing some initiatives from the state and local level that are complementing federal initiatives. But hopefully what we talk about tonight will illuminate some of these themes. So Professor Barry Smit, Barry, it's yours. Thank you.
Thank you. My record as an opening batsman visiting in Australia is not that good. Actually, my record as a bowler wasn't great either, but anyway, I had a lot of fun. These issues of climate change, water, forests, resources, are often considered as environmental issues. And it implies that addressing these as environmental issues involves some kind of trade-off with economic interest, as if it's a zero-sum game. And this is a false dichotomy. And that's actually constrained progress in climate change policy, in my view, both in Australia and in New Zealand. And I see it repeated day after day. Climate change is as much an economic issue as it is an environmental one. The causes of the changing climate are human, economic, emissions of greenhouse gases. The consequences of climate change certainly are ecological, but they're also economic. The Stern report estimates something 5 to 10% of the global economy. And the responses to the issue involve economic activities and sectors. That's one of the reasons it's so damn hard to make progress. So it's as much an economic issue as an environmental one. And the argument that by addressing climate change in a substantive way will necessarily incur economic costs is a spurious argument. There are many examples of economies who have made great progress on reducing their greenhouse gas emissions, or at least slowing them down, particularly in some of the Northern European countries, which actually have climates not unlike Canada. And their economies have not collapsed. In fact, they've benefited from investment in new alternative energy. It's a little bit like if we went back to when our communications were largely by carrier pigeon and Pony Express, and someone said, hey, we've got this new thing called telephone. Now, if the response at that time was, hang on a minute, if we go switch to that, we're going to lose economically in the pigeon industry and the Pony Express industry. All the subsidiary activities in Pony Express will have trouble. And indeed, that's true. There will be an adjustment, but I think most people would say that's to the benefit of all. So with addressing climate change, it seems to me that there will be adjustments in the economy, there'll be beneficiaries and there'll be losers, but it certainly is not addressing the environment at the cost to the economy. Yet this underlies a lot of the debate, a lot of the policy making on climate change, usually pushed by particular interests that feel themselves potentially gored. Getting more to the topic of today, the roles of governments and levels of governments in dealing with these issues. These roles vary greatly with the type of issue and its scale. So you can have some things that we can call largely local. Drinking water supply, perhaps under threat from contamination from wastes or from land use activities or something like that. It's often the case that these can be handled quite appropriately within state or provincial jurisdictions. They fit within there, they fit well, they can be handled, sometimes even delegated to municipal or lower levels. There are other issues that transcend states, or in our case, provinces. Classic one is water resources, where a river flows through one state to another, perhaps to another, and the use by people in one state has serious implications for that condition of that resource and hence its use in another state. These are flow-on effects, and I'm sure there are other names for them too, and I'm sure you're familiar with the Murray-Darling case. In Canada, we have somewhat similar issues in the Canadian prairies where some of the rivers flow from one province to another and there are disputes over access and use and water that is able to go to another jurisdiction. And these issues are really those of fairness or equity. Who has the right, because using it here will cause effects for the others. And in fact, in Canada, this issue also takes on an international dimension because some of the Canadian rivers flow between Canada and the US, both ways, well, not the same river. And these sometimes cause difficulties in times of low moisture, because one jurisdiction will hold back more water than might otherwise be available to the receiving jurisdiction. That's a problem. And also in periods of very high moisture where it's flooding, and one jurisdiction may spill more water than would otherwise be the case, and the recipient jurisdiction feels they're being flooded unnecessarily. Now, these sorts of issues tend to be resolved by commissions, joint commissions. In Canada, especially for the international, there's an international joint commission between Canada and the US, which adjudicates over these issues, both in rivers and in the Great Lakes. It's headed by representatives of the federal government, but it includes representatives of all the provinces and states. It functions really by goodwill and finding common ground, but these commissions are chaired by representatives of the federal government, and so ultimately they have the say. Now, if we go to climate change, and there are other issues like this, fisheries and some other ones, this is a little bit different in that it's a pure commons resource issue. And to illustrate what I mean by that, let's take a fisheries example. And we could take a Canadian one, the Atlantic cod fishery. There are many jurisdictions and sectors very interested in the Atlantic cod stocks. Several of the provinces in Canada depended on them for their economy and their livelihoods. The federal government has an interest in the cod stocks. US states and US federal government ultimately sowed European states also were fishing the cod stocks. So here we had a resource accessible to many users, all seeking to gain benefit from harvesting this resource. And beyond local waters, there was really no effective control regime, no rules of the game, other than the market. And in this case, the market prompted all interests to exploit the resource as rapidly as they could. Of course, there were attempts to limit that with drawing on the science at the time, but there were very powerful economic and hence political pressures to harvest that resource by all agencies. And people were reluctant not to harvest it because if they didn't, someone else would. The result of that, of course, was the collapse of the Atlantic cod fishery, not only to environmental detribute, but also to crashing of Atlantic economies. Very serious problems for the Atlantic economies, for communities, for industries, for jobs, and for the federal government, which had to now try and manage this big problem. It was a classic case of tragedy of the commons. And climate change is a little bit like that in the sense that it is a global commons. When Queensland or Ontario emit greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, it doesn't just affect their little bit of the atmosphere, it affects the whole thing. So the consequences of that are felt everywhere, just as when some other jurisdiction or place or sector emits gases into the atmosphere, it too is experienced by everyone, including Ontario and Queensland. And the responses to this issue also mean that if one country takes an initiative to reduce its greenhouse gases, it won't personally benefit from that unless everyone does or it affects the whole system. So it's a classic commons situation. And this leads most people to say, well, we should have some kind of international rules of the game, some kind of regime or framework such that everyone can agree. Then there would be an incentive to reduce your emissions because everyone else would be too, and therefore we could all benefit from this, and you wouldn't have free riders, that is those countries or people or sectors who are emitting like crazy but getting the benefit from the actions of others. Now, we actually do this in other areas. The World Trade Organization is an agreement, an international agreement among countries, where they give up a little bit of their autonomy in order that they have a set of rules which everyone abides by for the benefit of all. It seems strange to me that while we can do that for world trade, we can't do it for world climate. Now, this is a key issue in the international climate negotiations. And some people say that without an international agreement, there's not much point in countries attempting to do anything. Interesting point. I don't buy it completely, but we'll come back to that. For the moment, let's assume that there is some kind of international agreement, like a Kyoto or a Copenhagen, where either by commitment or obligation, countries intend to reduce their emissions somehow. What are the roles of states and federal governments in that process? Now, if you look in Canada, and it's probably similar in Australia, you'll find that each province has a different set of interests pushing the government. And not only a single set, usually it's a mix. So you have oil-producing provinces, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and you have major economies who believe they might be susceptible in some way, like Ontario. You have provinces that will argue they're particularly vulnerable to climate change and therefore they want to see action to mitigate it. They might be Prince Edward Island, low-lying, susceptible to sea level, or Nunavut, the Inuit areas of the far north of Canada. They're very active in saying they're particularly susceptible to climate change. Indeed, they're losing their polar bears. There you go. And then there are other provinces, British Columbia and Quebec, which have hydroelectric generation capacity and also a different attitude on the issue altogether. And they're actually pushing very hard for action on greenhouse gas mitigation. In fact, both of those provinces have already introduced carbon taxes in one form or another. So these diverse views, as you can see, are not consistent. They're a little bit like the whole world, actually. So you see the difficulty in getting consistency. So the federal government, well, it has to deal with all of these diverse views, both from provinces and from sectors independently. It has to try and address its international obligations to the extent that they exist. Each government, and there have been several during the climate change issue in Canada, has its own philosophy about economy and environment and the role of government. And then there are the power bases for the different governments as they come and go. However, even if the federal government in Canada had a very clear position and a clear strategy for, let's say, reducing greenhouse gases according to some target, the federal government has only limited means of achieving this. A lot of the levers for changing behaviour are in the hands of provinces. And so, while some provinces will argue that perhaps the best approach is some kind of market mechanism like a carbon trading scheme. In fact, most economists will argue that that's probably the most efficient way for a country to implement reduction of greenhouse gases. In Canada, that's difficult to sell politically at the moment. There are many sectors and interests that will simply use that use the label of increased taxes as a means of opposing what many others would argue is an efficient way of addressing it. So the result of all this in Canada is a rather disjointed patchwork of piecemeal policies. Probably less science-based than interest-based, but that's a reality. And yet there is some evidence of progress, both in the BC, Quebec, Ontario and others. In the federal government there's been progress, and certainly in the public willingness to take action on this. So you might ask, well, what if there was more authority at the federal level? Certainly, within Canada, if there was a set of rules to guide decisions on this, it would be very helpful, just as it would internationally. But it's not clear if that would make a huge difference necessarily in Canada's performance on reducing greenhouse gases. Because the government will have to take a stand at some time, and it may lean towards more the Alberta or more the Ontario or more the Quebec or whatever. And in fact, if you look at the USA, there's some interesting lessons. Under the Bush administration, where the Bush administration was clearly not that keen on action to deal with climate change, nonetheless, the USA, under the Kyoto period, was able to moderate its emissions more than was Canada and Australia. Not because of any action by the federal government necessarily, but because of the action of states, notably California and New York. With Obama, a president very keen on addressing climate change, there's yet to see any great evidence of a move to more effectively reduce greenhouse gases in the US. The key thing is, to me, is probably not so much the position of provinces, but the position of interests in the provinces and their role in the decision making. So the prospect, I believe that as more and more people become aware of climate change, as more and more people push for action on climate change at provincial or state level and at federal or Commonwealth level, we'll see more and more action. I'm pretty old for this group, but I can remember a time, not that long ago, 3 decades ago, 2 decades ago, whereas if you walked down the street and said to someone climate change, they wouldn't have a clue what you're talking about. If you talked about mitigation or carbon, they wouldn't have a clue. These days, lots and lots of people talk about it, and lots of progress has been made. And I think that the issue is to get beyond relatively short-term interest to look at more long-term benefit of overall. Now, this is not just naive hoping by some dopey professor. Well, it could be that too. But there are certainly examples where things have changed dramatically. 20 years ago, if we were in this room, half the people here would be smoking in this room. And yet, gradually, the science that smoking was detrimental to human health was more and more widely accepted. Sure, there were people denying it. In fact, there are people denying it today. Oh no, my uncle smoked all his life and didn't die of lung cancer, therefore the science on the relationship between smoking and lung cancer is false. What a load of nonsense. The point is that the science eventually demonstrated that this was an issue worthy of consideration by individuals, by governments, at all levels. And huge transformations in human behaviour have occurred, and now we think nothing of not smoking in this room. Another example was the hole in the ozone caused by our emissions of chlorofluorocarbons from hairspray, refrigerants and so forth. There was an international agreement called the Montreal Protocol, where all countries said, okay, this is a problem. It is threats to the environment, to economic activities and to human health. We need to reduce these emissions of CFCs. The actions by governments under that agreement were such that they actually modified the agreement to bring forward in time the conclusion of it because CFCs were effectively phased out. We still all our hair, well, most people's hair is in place, some of us doesn't matter too much. We still have economic activity. In fact, the industries that produced the CFCs were some of the major beneficiaries of that international agreement because they produced the alternatives to those products and sales boomed. So, key to action on this issue for me, partly governance structure, but probably more so public awareness and pressuring the various interests to take action. Yeah, thank you.
I neglected to mention when I was introducing the speakers that the format will be about 15 minutes of each speaker. We'll have a dialogue after that between the three of us here. Then finally, after that dialogue, we'll invite questions from the audience. So if you want to start thinking about questions, we'll certainly have time for that. There's a point I want to come back to with Barry, but a general observation. My resource management knowledge is fairly thin, but I do know a little bit about federations and their history. And certainly the way we're going about dealing with climate change is far more positive and optimistic than we have experienced in the field of water. I mean, 125 years in Australia now, we've been arguing about the allocation of water. There was a Royal Commission in New South Wales in 1884, which talked about a treaty with Victoria. It didn't get very far. We came to the constitutional debate about federation in 1898 in Melbourne. Water occupied a good 3 days. I mean, it was a very colourful, robust discussion. And we're still arguing about some of those things. The South Australians were worried about extraction of irrigation water from the Murray. What was the Constitution going to say about that? Good old Sir John Downer, the grandfather of our recent Foreign Minister, came up with that wonderful lawyer's weasel word to introduce into the Constitution. A reasonable amount of water could be extracted. People have been arguing about that reasonableness ever since. We had a proposal for Queensland, for New South Wales and Victoria and South Australia to get together in 1898 before Federation to discuss the management of the Murray-Darling. Queensland said, why can't we join in? The then New South Wales Premier, George Reid, said, what's Queensland got to do with the Murray-Darling? And the Queensland Premier said, our waters flow into the Darling. Surely we have a say. Reid's comeback was, but they're floodwaters, we don't want them. When Victoria and New South Wales couldn't agree, the New South Wales delegates who own the Murray raised the question that possibly Melbourne was an illegal settlement because it was drawing its water supply from the Murray. The Victorians responded, it's the Victorian streams that feed the Murray. This has been going on now for 125 years. One of the interesting little half secrets in Australian public life about water resources, the Snowy Mountains scheme, is probably constitutionally illegal. There was a lot of hush-hush about this at the time. The last thing the Commonwealth wanted was for it to be legally challenged. In 1958, the then South Australian Premier, Tom Playford, record time as Premier, and you'll see why in a minute, 27 years as Premier of South Australia, he was complaining that South Australia wasn't getting its share of the reduced flow down the Murray. He took out a writ against the Commonwealth. Well, Robert Menzies was then Prime Minister, sought advice from his government lawyers. They said, please settle with Mr Playford, because if this goes to the High Court, the whole Snowy scheme could be declared invalid. So Playford knew exactly the chip he was putting on the table then. We still haven't resolved all those issues. But as I said, we're getting somewhere with climate change. The thing one of the many points, one of them I'll take up with Barry, is there's another area of complexity I hadn't realised in the Canadian situation, that you have an international component having to deal with America, the United States. Has that ever been an issue, or have those water flow issues, and I'll forgive your excruciating pun about flow-on effect, have those issues ever become a diplomatic issue, or have they always been peaceably resolved? Barry, can you? No, I'm putting it on you.
Well, we're getting a little off topic. It's been a long-standing series of issues throughout the history of Canada and the United States. International Joint Commission was very much along the same time as Federation here. And it was established because there was recognition you had to have joint consultation and implementation sharing, but there's been, from time to time, disputes over both the allocation of waters and problems with flood waters as well that have required the International Joint Commission to look at the subjects in a highly charged and controversial subject at times. But it has worked its way through pretty well on some really charged issues.
Thank you, High Commissioner. Professor Steve Dovers, my neighbour from Queanbeyan, I'll happily hand over to you.
We had to mention that. Canberra, gateway to Queanbeyan. Forgive me if I cough a bit. I actually tried to think of a Federation joke, but I don't actually know any. Norman probably does, but I do know the answer to the question of why Tasmania doesn't drift away from the mainland, just because Victoria sucks. Now, I'm from New South Wales. In managing natural resources, Australia displays the usual range of benefits and costs of a federal system. So we have the complications, we have the conflicts, the delays of multiple jurisdictions. But we also have the valuable checks and balances of federalism and that priceless ability to run multiple policy experiments at a given time. So a central government can only get it right or wrong once at a given time. We can get it right and wrong in all sorts of ways and theoretically have the ability to learn from those multiple experiments. Now, we've had many experiments, and only a few of which I'll mention, and they're complicated by federation, but they're doubly complicated. As Barry said, these aren't environmental issues. They're really exercises in integration of ecological, social and environmental dimensions, and that's the agenda of sustainable development. So you've got the complication of federalism and the complication of that integration, and that makes natural resource management environment a very interesting area for thinking about federal systems. So what I want to do is give a textbook version of Australian federalism in the natural resource domain and then complicate that with some current realities and some outstanding questions for the future and then think about a little bit about how climate change might pan out. And the underlying question I won't answer but I'll encourage discussion on is, are we getting better at constructing collaborative, integrated, continental scale policy in this sector, in a federal system? And I won't talk about bushfires. I could, but it's a sensitive topic in Canberra at the moment. The textbook version, and it's true, is that constitutionally the states and territories have the vast bulk of powers over natural resources and environmental management, with the Commonwealth from about the 70s starting to have defined some coordinating roles and some specific roles in international dimensions and assessment and approval procedures. We got very excited in 1983 in the Franklin Dam case. That excitement faded very quickly because governments of both sides found that having legal fights with the states doesn't actually have a lot of political capital. And we realised that coordination and large dollops of money were much better ways to either gain consistency and collaboration or to shift policy direction around the continent. Now, in the textbook version, to drive broad proactive policy change in the environmental domain, the Commonwealth needs a hook of power or a lever of reform funding and generally a crisis. We generally need a crisis. So, for example, the regional forest agreements, which my colleague Peter knows far more about than me, but it was interesting there. It had a crisis. You may remember that trucks blocked off Parliament. And it had a hook, but it wasn't on the use of one of the very few heads of power the Commonwealth had at its disposal, but it was the promise of the Commonwealth taking its hands off a lever, which was export woodchip controls, in return for negotiated agreements that were sensibly carried out at a regional scale based on social, economic and environmental integration. Now, the RFA project wasn't perfect. Some agreements have been sound and some less robust, but it was a very good opportunity on how to make that careful, coordinated, continental scale policy. But I think it's one that we largely failed to learn lessons from. And I would really like to see us see agreement reached in our federation more often from the promise of lessened Commonwealth engagement than the threat of more or new Commonwealth engagement. Now, that's a challenge, and Norman might have something to say about minimalist Commonwealths, which we don't talk about very much, do we? The current period of water reform, which is all about implementing the National Water Initiative, is another stab at implementing that sustainable development idea of society, economy and environment. We keep running that experiment of how to do this in a fairly ad hoc fashion, and we don't really have a body of practice expertise. Now, in this case, the crisis was prolonged drought. The lever wasn't legal. It could become legal yet with High Court, but it was money and an apparent sense of genuine urgency to make up for years of policy neglect, most particularly over-allocation in New South Wales. Water policy in Australia is perfectly time-lagged to El Niño cycles. We do a lot when it's dry, and then we have a few wet years and policy decays. We'll see if that happens this time. And there's the recent slogan over the last few years, and it's for some reason come up again, about having a Commonwealth takeover of water. That's completely nonsensical, just as it is in health. The Commonwealth has neither the legal power and most certainly not the competence to manage a water system. If you want to know how many hydraulic engineers are employed by the Commonwealth, it's a very small number. But the increased role of the Commonwealth in resource management over the years is really significant. I think the National Water Initiative and the subsequent legislative and institutional developments are the biggest experiment we've run yet in a federal approach to managing the resource sector. On aspiration and intent, it gets an absolute high distinction on world scale. No one's trying anything like this. No one, no other country. And that's thanks to the drive of the Commonwealth and in principle agreement by the states. So far, on implementation, which is firmly in the states' court, I'd give it maybe a solid pass. Give it another year or two and it might get a credit. But the Commonwealth's very selective over what it gets involved in. The issues and targets that it targets for serious attention, the means it uses, and the persistence with which the Commonwealth engages in the sector. Coasts and cities, no, we don't go there. Forests and water, sure. The positive of Commonwealth engagement is consistency and forward momentum, but the negative can be confusion and a constantly shifting agenda. Now, one Commonwealth activity that has only in quite recent years become a permanent fixture is the NBFP, the new big funding program. We get one every election. And it gets renamed and retargeted. It emerges as a Natural Heritage Trust, a National Action Plan, or Caring for Our Country. The impact of that discretionary funding is totally out of proportion to the proportion it makes up of total resource and environmental management expenditure. It's a tiny proportion, but it has a huge agenda-setting power. Each program we've had gets criticised in audits. Stakeholders get put through the hoops of goalposts that shift all the time. The programs are arguably overly bureaucratised. They're complicated across the states, regions and local levels, and we can't actually point to solid outcomes. Now, that's something I don't think we've learnt to run Commonwealth-initiated national funding programs particularly well. But there's the textbook version, but there's a few outstanding questions about the Australian Federation and managing our environment. And my first one is the role of local government. That level of government, there's 600 of them and they're not even mentioned in the Constitution. It's more often than not left out of national policy debates, or it gets admitted late or at the margins. The Commonwealth has the money, the states have the power, and local government has the problems. Local governments in Australia are near breaking point in terms of the responsibilities they have compared to their financial and human resources, and I'll come back to that. Now, similarly problematic in our federal approach, it's all about the Commonwealth and the states. It should be about local government. It should also be about those 55, or is it 56? One of them never answers the phone, does it? Formal regional and catchment management organisations. That's the fourth tier of Australian environmental governance. We had 3, that was too complicated, so to make it better we came up with 4. Regions have been promoted as logical and necessary for quite a long time, but they've really been variably used and very variably supported. They were central a few years ago and now they've been marginalised. They represent an unfinished business, lots of potential, a very endangered investment of a lot of community time and expectation and commitment, and their place, I think, in a federal system is very fragile. Now, just to stir things up, I'm going to propose that we do away with the 55 regional organisations and replace them with better resourced and used regional organisation of councils, ROCs. They're an existing and proven institutional form, and they have democratic legitimacy and administrative competence, and their boundaries would be no less ridiculous in terms of natural processes than our current regions. Anyone here from a regional organisation? I think the last outstanding question for the future is a federal approach, or at least increased Commonwealth government engagement in urban matters of resource and environmental management. The vast bulk of Commonwealth and federalist activity has been in rural natural resource management, not in the cities. So we've been busy in that 95% of the land mass where the people and the economy don't live. And for 30 years, more than that now, Both sides of politics have kept well away from engaging with from the Commonwealth level to the cities, whether because they still think wrongly, believe that media and right-wing scare narrative about the Dirt era, or whether, quite rationally, they just thought it's a hiding to nothing going near the cities. But the current COAG-driven moves to national consistency in urban planning, resource management and development will be interesting to watch, because there's going to be big swags of votes, depending on how that goes. And that has not been the case with federalism and environment since the days of the Franklin. There aren't many votes in catchment management. So COAG's interesting. Council of Australian Governments. It's unfolding. It's sometimes crucially important, sometimes ineffective, and sometimes a sideshow, depending on the Prime Minister of the day. And it's always an opaque and boring mystery to 99% of the Australian population. But it's the most powerful policy forum and driver in the federal system. And when all the leaders march in tune, it achieves fundamental reform. Witness national competition policy in the 90s, played out by, to borrow from Mark Latham, a conga line of neoliberals from both levels of government. It was very effective policy reform, even though 99% of Australia about 10 years later went, what the hell was that? They forgot to tell the population about it. And recall that our current policy reforms are a direct descendant of the COAG water reforms. They weren't water reforms, they were competition reforms, and water was just a sideshow of microeconomic reform. And contrast that to the ecologically sustainable development strategy of the same era, which fizzled out, or as Ian Lowe said, got taken out behind the shed by some bureaucrats in Newton. But our current Prime Minister has said that he will turn COAG into the workhorse of federation. And so that promises much more fundamental federalist policy reform. But this time based on a structured work program, and it's a frightening work program, rather than the short-term and narrow use of COAG that's been used under previous Prime Ministers. It's going to take a long time to work through, though, and there are very few votes and very little media interest in the hard yards of coordinated policy reforms in complex domain undertaken behind the scenes in a federal system. The political rewards are very few for serious federalist policy work, and that is a problem. So climate change. Ross Garnaut called it diabolical as a policy problem, so it's worse than wicked as a policy problem, it appears. But it's not really a problem, it's an amalgam of many policy problems, and the simple split is mitigation and adaptation. Curbing greenhouse gases mitigation is actually a simple problem. Given a target, it's a simple problem. There are pervasive system-wide policy instruments that we can use to address the single most important source of emissions, fossil fuels, so an ETS or a carbon tax. And these systemic policy levers are in the hand of the Commonwealth. It's a simple problem. Now, the political alternative to that use of a systemic instrument, be it a trading system or a tax, is what's now called direct action. And that's a set of policy levers not in the hands of the Commonwealth. Absolutely not in the hands of the Commonwealth. Direct action can only rely on strong regulation and large-scale subsidies and must involve the states fundamentally and local government and regional groups, much more than a ETS or carbon tax. So the alternative is mitigation policy mired in the complications of the federal system for a very long time. That could be interesting, and it is pretty weird when we live in a country where the left proposes a market mechanism and the right proposes strong direct government intervention in systems of production and human behaviour. But that's a political debate, and I'm not a political scientist, so I wouldn't engage in it. Adaptation, on the other hand, is neither diabolical or simple, it's just very messy. And it's absolutely clear we can do a lot of adaptation right now in a very much no regrets fashion, but most isn't being done. And climate adaptation is being reinvented as a new problem, which it absolutely isn't. Many people at Commonwealth level seem unaware that drought policy, water allocation, stormwater management, agricultural R&D, public health, emergency management has all been for many decades about living in a variable climate. And it's not surprising because that's the stuff that state and local government do. And that's where the hard yards will have to be done. Not at federal level, and really not much at state level, but at local government level and by firms and households. And in the federal system we have, local government is going to be placed under significant pressure by climate change. It's going to have to do the heavy lifting of adaptation, and the states don't show any sign of reversing the decade-long trend of dumping tasks on local government while eroding their planning powers and their relative resources. When COAG show comes to town, local government gets to sit in the back stall. So that's a quick commentary on federalism. resource management and climate change. And occasionally we've reaped the benefits of that diversity and checks and balances of the federal system. But I don't think we've used those advances as building blocks to get better at the general game. Coordinated, integrated national scale policy is an experiment experiment we keep running, because when we ran the experiment last time, no one took the laboratory notes. I think climate change will, and increased variability will place further demands for coordinated national integrated policy development, and we can use that pressure as a driver for improvement or not. So we should have developed a reasonably competent approach by now. I mean, we've been doing it for a while. The one we've practiced on most, as Norman said, is water in the Murray-Darling. Serious policy discussion started in Corrigan in 1902, and in 2012 we'll see some allocation rules come into place. A regime that may or may not run smoothly, but that's only taken 11 decades. Maybe not, because we could have an election this year and government could change and we could have a Commonwealth takeover game going on, which is a patently silly idea, but it's good for another decade of sort of talking and arguing and stuffing about, rather than what we've got, which is an agreed, reasonably sensibly agreed position. So if that federalist experiment of national water policy reform works, then it's going to be a huge advance. It's the most serious attempt we've ever done at a general federalist and integrated policy regime. Now, if not, it'll be business back to confused usual, so we just watch that space over the next few years. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. I'm glad you brought up COAG, because it's crucial to some of these discussions, but the 17 or 18 years we've had COAG as the more recent successor to Premiers' Conferences, the old Interstate Commission, we're investing a lot of hope and faith in COAG as being a vehicle for resolving some of these issues. And I'm just wondering what your view is, Steve, on... We've heard about the establishment of COAG under Paul Keating, that it was committed to the idea of subsidiarity. That is, big issues would be handled by the level of government closest to those issues, closest to the people in each case, and whether you would see, which would be a reversal of the way things have gone in the Federation, whether you would see some genuine commitment to, particularly to local government or to regional groups of councils on the part of COAG in dealing with environmental issues.
Two comments on COAG, or COAG and subsidiarity, and I'll be interested in Barry's, what are the equivalent sort of bodies or discussions in Canada. One, COAG's biggest problem is the fact that it is completely unknown and dreadfully boring to 99.5% of the Australian population, because it's enormously, but it's undemocratic. I mean, entirely. It has no structure, it has no process, and it's very opaque. So there needs to be a level of improvement, at least in terms of the visibility of COAG. It's almost a PR problem, because I think we learned from national competition policy that it could be very effective, but it could leave the population very much behind, particularly if there was too much consensus, because there was no public argument. So I think we need to improve that part. There's been a lot of transfer downward from the Commonwealth to states and down to local and regional, but it's been a transfer of tasks and responsibilities and jobs. It has not been a transfer of power, and that's probably the missing element. The higher the level of government, the higher the likelihood that it's good to throw off an irksome task to someone, but certainly not to throw the ability to be a competent, legally, democratically and administratively competent body to do that. So subsidiarity is that it should go to the lowest appropriate level, but we should say the job and the means to do so should go to the lowest level. So don't use local government as a dumping ground for smelly tasks.
Barry, I wonder if you would care to comment on the dimension of intergovernmental cooperation in Canada. I should mention that the political environment in Australia, where you might have already gathered, there is significant distrust of the Commonwealth, of the states, and also the states of local government. So we've had a centralising tendency ever since we were settled. But I'm just wondering what scope for intergovernmental cooperation you're finding in Canada.
Provincial politicians are wary
to align themselves with initiatives of the federal government, even if they believe they're excellent, because there's a tendency, people in provinces, to say if it's federal, it must not be right. So there's that, which I gather is somewhat similar to here. On the issue of this other level that Steve brought up, the municipal or local level of government, that too plays a very important role in Canada in all of these issues, and on the climate change one, on both the what we call the mitigation side, that's reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and on the adaptation side, that means adapting to climate change effects. Many municipalities in Canada are looking at ways to reduce emissions within their municipality, not worrying about what's going on elsewhere in the country or federally. There is a Canadian Association of Municipalities, and they get together and they collaborate, and there are joint efforts, province and municipality. In fact, municipalities get their authority by delegation from the provinces. And on the adaptation side also, I strongly agree with my colleague that for adaptation, it's really a no-brainer in the sense that many individuals, businesses, and government agencies of all levels are already seeking for ways of reducing their vulnerability to changes in climatic conditions, along with all the other things that are important to them. So whether you're a water resource manager, a coastal zone manager, you're a ski industry manager or whatever, if a change in climate conditions represent either a threat or an opportunity to you, you'd be wise to incorporate that in your decision-making as the decision-making exists. So it's relatively easy. It actually doesn't require cooperation for that to occur, because the payoff from taking the adaptation initiative is to you. It's not a commons issue. It's quite a different one. Whereas on the mitigation side, municipalities are doing that to improve their energy efficiency, to improve their transportation systems and things like that. So certainly it's an important level in Canadian decision-making.
Steve, from some of your comments, I just wanted to see how far I could push you on whether you see our federal structure as it exists, as it has evolved, as being an impediment to dealing with pressing issues like climate change. I mean, we've seen the long, painful, protracted process of water management, water politics. Do we need to change the way we do things? And your conception of more regional involvement, is this some sort of a model pointing a direction in which our federalism should be thinking about?
I think it varies by the sector. Now, it is inconceivable to think of the Commonwealth playing an active managerial role in the water sector. You just can't do that from Canberra. Probably can't manage hospitals either very well.
That's not stopping them.
It didn't stop them for one hospital in Tasmania, and that didn't work very well. In the case of climate change, I think the point of where the policy levers are and where you can do things. So as a policy analyst looking for a tick-off for efficient, dependable, etc. criteria for policy instrument choice and who should do it, then a systemic instrument that operates across the economy, which is either a trading system or a tax, and I'm making no judgment on the efficacy of the currently designed ETS, but to use that one is much better from an efficiency point of view than trying to do it locally. Now, when it comes to adaptation, that's another matter, because again, if you want to manage the urban surface and stormwater and pathogen spread in a town, then you don't do that from Canberra. That's a local resource by state. It depends on the issue. And I think if we had to have a really federalist approach to climate change, we wouldn't have advanced as far as we have, even though we haven't quite got there yet. It's been because it's been handled more at the Commonwealth level on mitigation.
Along those lines, Barry, are we seeing a similar beginning of a rethink about federal structures in Canada dealing with very complex issues, or is it just part of a broader unfolding dialogue?
I'm sure there's lots of rethinking about federal structures, but this is such a monster that if it's to be moved in whatever direction, notwithstanding the magnitude of the climate change issue, that's probably not going to be the thing that pushes it one way or another. there are all sorts of things that prompt those who are toying with constitutional issues in Canada, and climate change is probably not even on the radar in that sense when you have the other constitutional issues in Canada. And the other thing that influences Canadian policy, regardless of who has what power in Canada, is its close association with the US. You know, one of the constraints on government action is the degree to which it's consistent with or compatible with US policy. You know, of course, Canadian government could take action independent or leadership or whatever it wishes, but the reality is that there are close ties economically and otherwise. So probably the association with the US is as much as of a constraint or stimulus for policy federally in Canada as positions of provinces or municipalities.
It's another chapter of complexity that Canada has.
Although I should point out that we have several thousand miles of ocean between us and the US, and it doesn't stop us taking a lead from them on those policy issues.
I'm happy to invite questions from the audience to either of our speakers. Gentleman in the middle.
I tend to think that as a layperson observing, we're just rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. If this is immediate, and if this is so serious, surely things like Copenhagen, if it ever exists, will make the situation much simpler, where there will have to be a unilateral intervention by federalist powers, either through the external affairs power or taxing power, on the primacy of federal law. Can we go back to, and we seem to have moved away from the power of federal governments to act with international instruments. Will this clear up a lot of the micromanagement that seems to be such a political dilemma at present in Australia and most other countries in the world?
You're really talking about the power of an international treaty to bind a national government. Would both of our speakers like to comment on that?
Well, it's not inconceivable that under some future international regime to which we are a party, that there would be a potential use of Commonwealth legal powers. But to take the war analogy, in World War II, the Commonwealth adopted a certain set of powers that it was meant to give back. And I think the last Premier to seriously sort of raise the possibility of the states taking back taxation power was Nick Greiner, and he quickly realised that that was a very silly idea. So there was a power taken because of a war situation, and it's precisely the power which I'm suggesting is the most singly efficient and systemic tool to use for... I actually think a tax would be far better than ETS, that's personal opinion. But I'm not sure if there's a prospect of an international agreement that could be used under the Commonwealth powers. And I'm not sure how the trade power would come. That's probably going to hit in water between South Australia and Victoria. But there you have the wartime tax powers, forgot to give them back. There's your instrument of federal power to use in the climate war.
Didn't forget, refused.
Refused.
Barry, would you like to comment on that?
The point you make as a motivation for stronger action, international agreement, and then subsequently national action, is well established in the international negotiations already. In 1992, countries of the world signed the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. No disputes, everyone still is a signatory to that. And that established the principles by which countries of the world agreed to address the climate change issue. And the opening statement of that, the ultimate objective of the Framework Convention on Climate Change, is to avoid dangerous human intervention in the climate system. Since that time, 1992, I've been to probably 35 international meetings trying to define what is dangerous. And it goes to your point. If everyone said, I believe this is really dangerous, then there's an obligation on the parties to take much more serious action than they otherwise would. And similarly, quite apart from international agreement, I think your point is well taken. If there's a powerful belief in countries that the issue is serious, dangerous, really dangerous, diabolically dangerous, whatever, then that presumably would provide motivation for more action by all levels of government, and maybe even changes in the responsibilities and authorities at different levels. So indeed, your observation that how serious is this, if it's just a few, using the war analogy, if it's just a few pirates shooting off, as opposed to a full-scale onslaught, that'll motivate the public and politicians. I believe that's actually not a bad analogy, in the sense that it has to empower the public to such a point that politicians feel that they're able to take action on it.
Another question down the front here.
Neither of the speakers have mentioned population, and it just seems to me that that's quite a big problem in terms of the way the Commonwealth works in Australia, in the sense that the Commonwealth government makes the decisions about populations, and that dramatically impacts a whole array of policy decisions that are possible at a local government or a state government level. You know, if the Commonwealth government stabilises the population, they can do one thing. If it dramatically increases it, as it is doing, they pretty much rip up all their policies and plans. There seems to be a really basic problem in the way decisions work in Australia. Do you have any thoughts or suggestions on that one?
I suppose that I gave up doing population research in the 90s because no matter how reasonable I tried to be, I got attacked by both sides. So I have no comment on the number, and I'm not going to engage in Kevin Rudd's big Australia debate, but it is certainly the case that we lack coordination in settlement policy in Australia between the three levels of government. Our two local governments in Australia have tried to stop population growth within their domains, and both were squashed very quickly by their relative state governments, being New South Wales and Queensland. We have an interesting move just this week for a Minister for Population. Indonesia has one of those who used to hand around condoms for free in public, so I'll be interested to see what Tony Burke does with his new portfolio. But that is a very small indication that I don't like a debate about raw numbers, because we could stuff up Australia very well with 10 million people or 50 million people, depending on how we manage ourselves and our resources. But there's certainly a chronic lack of coordination between the three levels of governments on human population settlement. Now, we used to have a National Population Council. We used to have a quite competent Bureau of Immigration and Population Research. Now, both of these disappeared, and we currently have no underpinnings for even sensible numbers and policy debate. So without buying into the number debate, we certainly leave states, and particularly local government, in a dreadful position of, you know, turning the tap on and off, but really having no sensible regional strategic planning that is connected to settlement policy.
Before I ask Barry to comment on that, I might just mention that state governments seem to be in retreat from this. We once had state ministers, state departments of decentralisation. And if we think back about some of the Commonwealth involvement in these things, whatever happened to Bathurst Orange, the Bathurst Orange Growth Centre, the multifunctional polis in South Australia, Albury Wodonga, off the agenda. Barry, do you want to comment on the population issue?
When I left, Canada still didn't have a Minister of Population.
Neither did we when you left Canada.
Oh, that's true. And actually, I don't think they have one yet. Is that, no, we don't. However, I think your point's right on. If you're interested in the ability of the Earth and the people on it and the livelihoods of those people to sustain themselves through time, you've got to have human population as a key part of that consideration. Malthus had a point. And so we can do all the tweaking we would like with regard to new technologies, and I'm a believer in those, and different policies, and I'm a believer in those. But if we continue to have these huge increases in vast numbers of people trying to eke out a living on the planet, that will seriously constrain our ability to achieve those goals. So I'm not going to get into how globally that's done, how you do it nationally, whether the Chinese solution is better than the Indonesian solution or anything else, but it's a huge issue and it needs to be addressed. Otherwise, we're not going to make any much of a difference on these issues.
Actually, could I add? I recall it would have been 20 years ago that I think it was Christabel Young wrote a very good article called "Let's Have Some Demography in the Population Debate." And I think that plea still stands. Now, I'm quite convinced by Graham Hugo's argument for the necessity, economically and socially, for near-term population growth in Australia, and then the ability to have a stable and non-problematic population structure in not perpetuity, we don't go that far, at somewhat less than Kevin Rudd's target. But that sort of reasoned demographic analysis, all we get in the media is, I won't name names, but pop demographers who are just out there sloganeering. So we have a really poor level of debate in Australia about population. And part of it is demography is boring. And the other part is there's all sorts of ideological and also religious undertones to the debate and racial undertones, which a lot of people would rather just lay off that particular debate.
Professor Smit, I'm intrigued by the role of the North American Free Trade Agreement and other similar agreements in this debate. Have they affected Canada's position in any way, shape or form?
Indeed, because they introduce the idea of competitiveness in economic areas. And so, and also as part of that, there's an there's an environmental commission, I believe it is, that ensures that economic developments within the trade agreement aren't at the detriment of the environment. There's a check on that. But it reinforces this point that a lot of the Canadian politicians will argue it's difficult for them to take big steps unilaterally because they're bound tightly with respect to the free trade agreement. Some of the provinces, which are also bound by those free trade arrangements, have taken steps, some of them even in alliances with US states. There's a Western Climate Alliance of some kind, there's a Eastern one which transcend international borders but don't necessarily include all of the provinces of Canada. So it's a very interesting structure. It's more people who have a like vision of what might be done and can be done, so they're getting together on that.
Borders are literally breaking down.
Borders, well, in that sense, yeah.
Adam.
Oh, someone already has the mic.
Sorry.
Just a question to the panel regarding alternative energy. I think we all would like to see a shift, perhaps a gradual shift, away from burning fossil fuels towards renewable energy. And I, for one, see solar and geothermal as the two of the best options. There are others, but I think these are the most important. How does the panel see the role of federal governments vis-à-vis the states and in Canada the provinces, and vis-à-vis private enterprise with providing the basic infrastructure to facilitate development of these resources? I mean, Australia has enormous resources of both solar and geothermal energy, but what's holding certainly geothermal energy back at the moment is the lack of a national grid system to provide that energy to where it's needed.
Want to give a Canadian perspective first, Barry?
The role of governments in facilitating transfers from different forms to energy is a hot topic of debate in Canada. It's not my area of expertise, but it's clear that there are those who would argue that there's significant government subsidy for particular forms of energy extraction or for energy supply, fossil fuels, for example. And others would also say there's infrastructure support for activities which use those particular sources of energy. And there needs to be something of a level playing field, if nothing else, if not inducement for the development of alternative energy sources, because that makes sense for so many. But at least a level playing field so that the development of alternative energy has the same government support and subsidy as conventional or fossil fuel sources.
Steve?
I'd give the Commonwealth 4 jobs in driving reform, and I agree. I wouldn't limit it to geothermal and solar. But one is to influence pricing. And I'm actually not an economist. I'm actually a bit of a raving socialist, but I do think that the price mechanism when it comes to carbon is a no-brainer. That's one. Remove subsidies, not too quickly, but remove any perverse subsidies. Limited in the infrastructure game, just because I don't think government's particularly fantastic at quick-hit infrastructure. We've seen some cases of that lately. And the other one would be long-term investment in R&D. Not very quick 3 to 5 year hits of money into a particular technology. Now, the same year that the Bureau of Immigration and Population Research was axed, we discontinued the Energy R&D Corporation. Now, here's a little what-if story. If we'd kept the Energy R&D Corp going, and if we had what was proposed in the early 90s and squashed by Senator Faulkner's own cabinet colleagues in public, which was a modest carbon levy, and that had been put into alternative energy R&D, 15 years on, Australia would probably be where it was way back then, which is a world leader rather than a world follower in technologies to make the most of our abundant sunshine. And as a German journalist said to me quite recently, why have we got more solar technology than Australia? This is ridiculous. And I said, yes, it is. But we disinvested in that. So long-term R&D, I think, would actually be the most useful direct government activity it could do.
Should have sat you on my left, Steve, not my right after hearing that.
Bit of a comment for the panel and a broad sort of question. Australia and Canada are both resource-rich countries, and respectively we're feeding the 2 largest polluters in China and the United States. Does the panel have any comments or thoughts on that situation and resolutions for it long term?
Steve?
Well, if Australia has got China, then at least their per capita levels of consumption and emissions is and will be for a very long time far, far lower than the lot that Canada is supporting, so I'll blame him.
You got the right to reply, Barry.
No, I've lost the question.
I think it's the responsibility of export countries such as Australia for their the impact of their exports. So yes,
sure. If you first of all, the premise about who is the biggest polluting country in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, again, it's how you measure it. If you measure it per capita, Australia and Canada are right up there with the champions. China's up there because it's a huge population. Bangladesh would even get up there, and their emissions are from 2 people hiccuping and farting twice a day or something. So it depends on the basis of your comparison. In terms of if you're assigning greenhouse gas emissions or carbon generation, how do you do that? Do you do it at the point of consumption or the point of production? That's a tricky issue, and certainly a lot of in Canada, internally within Canada, that debate is hot because the oil producers would say, well, we're producing because you people want to use it. You should be charged with the credit of your burning. And in fact, most carbon trading credit systems that I know of actually operate that way. The producers of oil and coal are charged with the generation of emissions involved in the extraction, not in its subsequent use. So if I use an automobile that burns it, I get credited with the emissions, not the person who generated the oil, which is consistent again with the market mechanism. So if countries buy products, but in the making of those I generate greenhouse gases, that's me who gets the charge for that. If someone in consuming my product generates it, they do. That tends to be the logic of the carbon trading scheme to address that point. But there are many, many models.
One more question here.
The government of Manitoba's got a memorandum of understanding with the South Australian government, and it covers climate change, drought, I think also fire, water, a number of issues.
Not polar bears.
Sorry?
Not polar bears.
Not polar bears. No. So that memorandum of understanding, as I understand it, is about sharing research, ideas, policy lessons, whatnot. So I wonder, I don't know anything more about it than that. If anyone here knows about whether or not there have been any outcomes from that, and whether or not such a model could be a good model for populating more broadly between other provinces and Australian states and territories.
Lisa's the only person in this room that knows that there's an agreement between Manitoba and South Australia.
Well, I mean, from a constitutional point of view, it's limited to information sharing. I mean, but do you want to elaborate on that, Barry?
Well, there are probably hundreds, maybe thousands of agreements to exchange inside technology. In fact, under the Framework Convention, and in fact under the Kyoto Protocol, when it existed, there were inducements for countries to share insights, understanding technology. In fact, you could even get a credit. You know, if you're a rich country and you helped a poor country with its development in a way that didn't emit greenhouse gases as it might otherwise have done, you actually could count that as part of your greenhouse emissions reduction. So, and those all operated through memorandums of understanding and other sorts of agreements. There are lots and lots of those, probably should be more, particularly, well, both in the mitigation side, but also the adaptation side, because Manitoba has to deal with droughts and floods, by the way, and I'm not that familiar with South Australia, but I assume it has the same sorts of things. So I'm sure there are lots of issues that fall clearly within their jurisdictions for which ideas could be shared profitably.
I mean, if you were to construct any single relationship in terms of learning about resource management, climate change, etc., yeah, Australia and Canada would be, you know, the only two federations with a Westminster system with not dissimilar economic structures and all of that. I mean, it is an extremely logical one. ANU should have better partnerships in Canada rather than other parts of the Northern Hemisphere. Yeah.
Could I thank Professor Smit, our distinguished guest, our Nobel co-laureate, Professor Dovers, for their contributions tonight. Your Excellency, thank you for facilitating this. Thank you, Professor Stefan.